Hey everybody, this is Tony.
And this is Paul, and we're coming at you from the Friends for Life podcast, where we discuss the ongoing lives and issues of people with developmental disabilities to spark positive change in the field.
And we have a lot of fun doing it.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Friends for Life podcast. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. John Dickerson of Quillo. John, how are you doing this afternoon?
Doing great, Paul, and thanks for having me with you.
Absolutely. We're definitely excited to talk to you because you have some important information with your business and, especially now with how things are running in this field with staff and essentially how they've always been running with staff and the crisis that we're going through. You've got some innovative ways to work through that. But before we get into that stuff, we're always interested to know how you got into the field, the IDD field in general, and you're a veteran yourself. You've been in it for quite a while. So where did that come from for you?
Well, veteran's a nice word for being old. So, I started in the field, Paul, in 1973. I went to college to become a high school football coach and a teacher, played college football in a little school in South Dakota. And when I graduated, there was just a ton of graduates and not a lot of teaching jobs. Mm-hmm. And one of my football coaches was one of the first professors of special education in 1970s in the state of South Dakota. And he said, you should go talk to these people at the ARC, what was then called the Association for Retarded Children. Mm. And he said, they're looking for somebody, they don't have much money, but I think you'd enjoy it. And so I said, sure, don't have a job. And next thing you know, I was working for the ARC of South Dakota, working with young people and getting them involved. My very first day on the job, my boss took me to a meeting and he said, we're going to be going to a meeting about writing the very first rules for mandatory special education in the state of South Dakota.
Whoa.
1973. Up until that time, kids with disabilities could not go to public school with their brothers and sisters.
Wow.
It was up to the local school system to decide whether your son or daughter, brother or sister, got to go to school or not. So that was my first day on the job. From there, I spent a year in South Dakota, which is where I'm from. Then came to Indiana, spent 5 years with the ARC of Indiana, was at the national level for about 5 years, and then came back and spent 32 years as the executive director of the ARC of Indiana, an advocacy group for people with disabilities and their families. I was a lobbyist. I spent my life convincing legislators to fund programs like Friends for Life and beginning to see the changes that we went on. I retired in 2015, lost my mind, I say, for a year and ran for public office.
I know that
and
life.
that didn't end up the way I wanted, but probably the way it should. And then started looking around and was tasked by some friends of mine to say, we really need to think differently about this staffing issue. This is long before the pandemic. Turnover was a challenge. How do we communicate with families? How do we communicate with people with disabilities in different ways? And so I went on this journey of thinking, how could we do things differently? And the result, after talking to about 2 years with people, is we launched Quillo, an innovative software platform that's all about the why of what we do and building expectations for a good life, building expectations about Friends for Life. I love the name of your organization because it's all about relationships, and that's what we're all about at Quillo.
Yeah, and that is pretty much, you hit the nail on the head. Relationships is what this field is about, and that's what Tony built this company on. But looking through Quillo, said something like 70% of employees feel like they have negative interactions with supervisors or, people higher up in the company. And, here, just as with any company, we have the same turnover issue that everyone's having right now. And we talked with Scott DeFacel a few weeks ago, and we were, our minds were blown away with some of the information and he introduced us to you, which thankfully we're trying to give people the best information about what works and how to think differently about this, because we're not competing with McDonald's as we were so schooled in last week. So what are you noticing? What are all of these providers thinking wrongly about with this turnover? And what's Quillo doing to kind of help facilitate that?
Or what are some thinking right about?
Yeah, true.
And I'm a real believer. I don't know if you guys have read much about this idea about appreciative inquiry. So we're all taught as human service professionals to solve problems, right? Analyze it, look at your strengths and weaknesses, and solve the problem. And if all you do is spend your time solving problems, you don't take a moment and appreciate what's really working. And Tony, I love when you said, what are people thinking right? Because we are finding now people starting to sense that we've got to become as person-centered around our staff as we are about the people we served. And so when we were doing our research, we found really interesting things. And you touched on it, Paul, that when we interviewed over 200 DSPs around the country, and that's where that 70% number came, we asked them to rate personally their own scale. Was their interaction with their supervisor predominantly positive, predominantly neutral, or predominantly negative? 70% said it's predominantly negative. Not Tony calling up Paul and saying, Paul, you worthless person, what the heck's wrong with you? No, they only called when there was a problem. They weren't calling to celebrate success. They weren't calling to say, hey, what you did with Sam, he's making great progress. Not because they didn't want to, but because they were so focused on solving problems. And so we built Quillo on the idea of positive psychology. How do we tell positive short stories that go out to staff cell phones, tablets, or computers that are built around the successes we see, big and small, and built around their personal well-being? I'm a big believer that we got to get to know our staff just like we have to know the people we take care of and support and help them build their independence. That the idea is all around this idea of communicating in a different way. For example, think about orientation at your organization. And like with a lot of organizations, we have requirements we have to do for training. But do we introduce the why of what we're doing in orientation? Do we introduce them to a person with a disability and what their views in their life are all about? The idea behind Quillo is to turn the switch and say, let's support people in doing what they want to do, which is help people grow, be independent, not be caregivers, but be guides along this journey for people that help them reach a greater degree of independence.
Wow, that sounds awesome because it truly breaks up the dynamic of what people are normally thinking. How do you guys track success? Success rates? Is it an algorithm that you go by, or is it just kind of filling things out?
We have a library now that's about 2,500 videos. So every day, a staff member comes in, signs up, and they can say, here's the area that I work in. Here's the areas I'm most interested in. Here's the things I want to learn more about. And it's pulls from the library and pushes out information that they're really interested in. And we have videos that not only come from us, but comes from you guys. So that one of the things we've learned is that people, particularly in residential, but also in day programs and social work and case managers, don't often feel as connected to the organization as they would like to be. Especially younger people coming in. They want to be connected to the mission of what they're doing. Not the what and the how, but the why. And are they making the difference? And Paul, you said something really interesting. We're not competing with McDonald's. If you want a job at McDonald's, you're looking for a certain thing. If you're wanting in this field, you're attracting people that want to make a difference in what they're doing. And we have to, and that's where I think the guys at Blitz have helped solve the riddle of how do we communicate in some different ways with folks, our own expectations, and where we want you to grow and develop. So our videos go out And we work with our customers to help build their own library of communication, of talking about what's important to them. Why did you start the company, Tony? What got you involved? Reminding people over and over again about the why and why they're important. One CEO I talked to, he said, it is difficult to me to think about what I will record to say to my staff. Mm-hmm. And all of our videos, I should say, are 60 seconds or less. Yeah. Why? Because we're short attention span people, And our staff are busy. 40% of them are working 2 jobs to get by, or they're working overtime. And so the idea of, in a short few seconds, how do we get a message across that is inspirational, repetitive, and helps them think a little bit along the way? And what they found is 80% of our people said they felt more included and connected to their organization when they heard their leaders talking to them about the why. And so much of what we teach and train is about compliance and billing and safety. All of those things are important, but we got to make sure we get back to the why. Good example of this, one of our authors, and we call our people authors, is out of Chicago, and she followed around some DSPs for about a week. She found 90% of the communication coming from the person with the disability supported was relationship-based. Tony, I love your mustache. How long have you had that? I've always wanted to have a mustache. Paul, your beard, my gosh, how do you even eat with that beard? And it's relationship-based, right? Conversely,
that is so. I'm amazed, because that's always been my approach. And this is why I've always been a better DSP than anything else. And, not to steal the show per se, but that it's like it's a part of me to do that with people, to connect with people in some form or fashion. And the individuals that I serve, that was the best way. Even if the individual is placed in a wheelchair for any reason, I'm bigging up the wheelchair that they got. Instead of them feeling down that they probably are in one, hey, maybe look at the bells and whistles on this thing. Like, come on. And it was just little starts like that created a bond.
You're so right, Tony. And, where we missed the boat is what Leanne found, and she runs a training program called Blue Tower Solutions. She found that, the individual with the disability, 90% of their conversation was relationship-based. The DSP, 90% of their communication back was giving directions, telling people what to do. So imagine that disconnect. I'm here wanting to build this relationship with you, and all you're doing with me is, it's 7:45 at night. We got to start getting ready for bed. And I don't care that you're watching the Cleveland Cavaliers play. It's time for bed. We're into a schedule. The idea that we've got to start changing this dynamic, that it's about relationships and talking about how do you help people on this journey, that you're not there always to just be their friend or their caregiver. You're there to help them grow and develop, make choices, learn about making choices, and listening to them about what they want in their life. And that's a very different role. And so what we came at it from Kulo is the idea of how do we help build that communication around the various different topics that you have, even the language that we use with people. I really try to stay away from, and I find myself slipping into it, when we talk about caregivers. That's a different connotation than being a guide or being a helper to someone when they need it along the way. And how do we really listen to people? How do we also share messages with people with disabilities about them showing gratitude and appreciation to the staff that are around them? Yes. That it becomes this team as opposed to this relationship based on compliance and rules. That it becomes a team based on what do you want as a good life? Where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? And how do you explore that? one of the great experiences we had is with DSPs and the people they supported sharing their dreams. Mm-hmm. You know, and one of the staff members said, well, easy way to get into that is asking the question, what is it you really love that brings you joy? And this DSP said, well, the happiest I am is on Sunday morning when I sing in the church choir. And all of a sudden, the three ladies in this home said, we never know you sing in a choir. Can we come listen to you sing in the choir? And she said, well, sure. You know, we got to figure out transportation. We got to figure out the schedule, you know. But the next thing you know, these three ladies are going to see her sing in her church. Now, just to make it interesting in this story, the DSP happened to be African American. The three women happened to be white. They loved going to this black church. Yeah. And they had never been to a 3-hour church service on a Sunday morning.
They must have had a lot of time on their hands.
They loved it. One lady actually joined the church and asked to join the choir. And so this DSP takes her into the church. The other two still visit. It wasn't quite their thing, but they always want to come see and support her, honor what brings joy in her life. Now, that is a very different relationship than building out this idea that it's all about compliance and rules and schedules for people. So the idea that I can help support you and you can help support me along the way as we become closer and understanding each other is all part of building that satisfaction with what you're doing in your life. And you're less likely to leave people along the way and go try something else.
So what you're saying is treating people like human beings is a good way to be happy in your life and your job.
Absolutely. You know, especially in these times where people have choices.
Yeah.
You know, one of our counties in Indiana, I'm in Indianapolis, they have an unemployment rate below 1%.
Wow.
So the idea of how much do you work at building a culture of inclusion? And great speaker I heard the other day said, you can't have inclusion without a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
If you ask your staff, do they belong in your organization? Do they belong to Friends for Life? And belonging has two meanings, and I wrote a blog about this. Belonging has two sides to the coin. One is I belong here. It's right for me to be here. This is the right place for me to be in my life right now. The second meaning of belonging is that I feel welcomed, valued, appreciated, and liked within this organization. That I feel like I want to belong there because I share some values and it's part of what I believe in making a difference. And again, how often do we talk about that with staff, or do we talk about when things go wrong? You know, one of the things, unfortunately, we get so busy that we only reach out when things go wrong. Staff told us, again, you know, I don't like answering my phone because I'm going to be asked to work a second shift. And if I can talk about phones for a minute, you know, we have agencies that have these rules about if we catch you on your phone, we're going to fire you.
Oh, man.
Except if you're on your phone when we call you, right? We don't even want your kids to call you and talk to you. I mean, you know, it's just totally out of whack with the world that we live in. Now, we don't want them Facebooking and watching movies on their phone. But at the same time, we have to treat people with dignity and respect of what they can make the right choices along the way. But this idea that how do we begin rethinking what we do and building this culture of inclusion? And I often ask people, how much time do you spend in your organization building the culture of your organization?
Yeah.
And people will say to me, the first answer is almost always not enough. And then the second answer will be an hour or two a month or an hour or two a week. And I say to them, I would suggest to you that every minute of every day, you're building the culture of your organization. For good or better or worse, because it's how you treat your people that is important in building that culture. Visited a very large organization, 10,000 employees. And they had the most bureaucratic rules that would make any government agency feel shamed of how they treated their folks. Goodness. That everything was driven by compliance, sign in on your phone, check out on your phone, put people's goals down and rules. There was very little time for human interaction. That isn't what people signed up for. Mm-hmm. They signed up to work with people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And that's what drove them to it. So the idea of how do our organizational processes line up? How do our rules line up with our person-centered thinking? And how do we spend our time? Is it on paperwork, rules, compliance, or is it on building people's lives? And that becomes this idea of building a culture of, we talk about the wheel, the culture wheel, where you talk about your policies and procedures. Mm-hmm. Do they fit your culture? How do you spend your time? Does where your time match up to where you say your values are? Mm-hmm. Those things are really important because you can say all the things you want about what we believe in. Yeah. But if you don't live it, nobody believes you. Yeah. That's what you're doing with that. And so you begin looking at then the relationships you have. Do people feel like they belong, that they're welcomed? If they have a different idea, can they say that and get that out? How do you have, people say I have an open door. Well, our people work at night and away and they're never in the office. So how can you have an open door? How can you make yourself accessible to them? And that becomes this issue of how do you build that culture of belonging that is important to keep people. I discovered an agency in Canada, and I promise I won't give out their name anymore because they've been inundated with people calling them, but I can tell you it's the truth. A small agency in Canada. They serve a couple hundred people, I believe, but they have a 4% turnover rate.
Cool.
That's 4%.
Very impressive.
And they said when we started off 14 years ago, we just started off with a culture of being person-centered for our staff as much as we are with our people we serve. And we've ingrained this over 14 years, and we're never going to give up on it. We don't even advertise for DSPs now. It's just other people telling folks to come work here. You'll be treated so well on how we do that. Now, if somebody's looking for a magic answer, this isn't a 15-minute fix you're going to do in your organization. Yeah, right. This is something you got to step off the gerbil wheel where you're running as fast as you are to replace people and say, we've got to do something different. And that's where I think you asked a question a while back. It's really hard for people to get off that spinning wheel and say, we've got to do something. Agency, again, very large agency, talked to me and they said, well, we practice, unfortunately, desperation hiring. Mm-hmm. That we will hire anybody if they can pass a background check and they're breathing because we're so desperate for staff. And I said, how is that working for you? And they said, well, honestly, we replace 83% of them in the first 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. And I said, have you thought about what do you change to do differently? Not wholesale, but make some changes. How would you do it differently? And what could you do differently? And he said, I don't have time to do anything differently. Oh. So he's trapped in that wheel and it'll never change. I introduced him to our friends at Blitz, and he said, I don't have time to do things differently like this. And so for that guy, it's like, God bless, good luck.
Yeah.
And, in his defense, I know how scary that can be. We're honestly going through the process here. And it got to the point where I was working with my team to pull back so much, we're starting looking at overhead. Like, okay, we're financially in a very tight place, before we start eating in savings and stuff. Like, how are we going to do this? But there is a glimmer of hope because we are noticing the changes. We have brought in companies like BizPulsar who help us grow our culture and change the dynamic of the way we think and the way that we interact, which is in in the long run, we're already starting to see the changes. And I know exactly what you ever go to the gym and you get on the treadmill and you start running. As soon as you get off, your feet just feel like we're like numb, but like they still want to move. So you want to hop back on just to keep going so you can get rid of that uncomfortable feeling. Mm-hmm. But I was like, you know what? We're just going to come off of this. We're going to slow it way down, and we're going to get things the right way. We're looking for people 4 or 5 years of true dedication, and then actually lifetime from there. Because even if you leave and you set a different path, I think the communication and the interaction with the individual is very important when it's a clean, appropriate one. Like, if it's going to be some kind of shady underhandedness, that's never, I think, the way that people should go about things. But if there is a real justifiable, like, connection there that this person and these people have made life goals together almost, like that to me outweighs anything that we do in business. And I think we can be rewarded for it if we do it the right way. And I don't know, I guess finding the right way is the trial and error.
Tony, you're absolutely right. And I do empathize with this guy because, again, it's somebody I know well, and he's a good guy, and they're trying to do the best they can. And, it'll be next year in 2023. I find it hard to believe, but I'll be celebrating 50 years in this field. I never thought I'd spend 5 years in this field.
Congratulations, man.
But I don't think it's ever been as difficult, and I say this seriously, ever been as difficult to provide services as it is right now. I think the combination of we're still dealing with the rules of pandemic. A friend of mine went down to Anchor for the big provider conference this last week, came back with COVID. You go to a large meeting, you take a risk in how doing that. And we're still dealing with people having COVID as staff, people with disabilities, and the impact of that. The economic situation we're in, where for a lot of reasons outside of everybody's control, prices on everything are going up. And we know that the pay isn't going up, the reimbursement isn't going enough to be able to keep up with this. And anybody going to the gas pump realizes what life is like and what we do. True. And so then you have all the political turmoil in the world going on with folks. Then we have the issues of social inequality that we're dealing with. 60 to 70% of our workforce are people of color and predominantly women. They live the impact of social inequality and the questions around the legal system and the fears that people have around that every day. Mm-hmm. And so we want them to come and leave that all behind and come to be these staff that are very engaged and involved in what we're doing. And I continue to talk to our customers about the idea of how are you addressing this issue within your organization. And it's not enough to say, Black Lives Matter. What are we doing with our own organization to address inequality and how we treat people and what we're doing? And those are some of the issues as we talk about. The other part of Quillo that we're developing now is a program called Quillo Connect, which is aimed at families and individuals with disabilities. Again, communicating in a whole new way. What we learned in is researching this is we asked families, when do you hear from your provider or from the state government? And they said, usually when something goes wrong or there's a change in our budget that we can't do something that we once did before. When do we tell families or individuals when things go right? One of the videos we did was a true story about a fellow named Eddie. I actually changed the name, but I'll use Eddie here. And Eddie called me up one day and he says, John, how come everybody in my team meeting has a file on me except me? I said, damn, Eddie, that's a good question. And he said, yeah, they won't let me look at it. And I said, well, why is that? They said, well, it's all private information. So I happened to call the executive director and said, Eddie'd like to see his file. Well, why? Well, it's about him. And so, long story short, we had got Eddie to see his file. It's about 4 inches thick. Eddie was 42 years old. In there was a statement from his high school guidance counselor saying that he was non-compliant.
Wow.
And when we looked at his file, Eddie's looking at me, and Eddie didn't read. And he said, John, didn't I ever do anything right in my life? Everything in his file were all the times he'd screwed up.
Dang.
So we put in a yellow folder in his file and said, let's just start putting in the yellow folder all the cool and good things Eddie's doing. And it changed the whole dynamic of what we were talking about. And this idea of how do we focus on what people's strengths are rather than their weaknesses makes all the difference in the world. A little orneriness we had here, because it didn't go as smoothly as that when we asked him to see his folder. The executive director, who was a friend of mine, said, well, we'll have to think about that. So Eddie asked for another meeting, and I gave him a folder, and in it was just a little notepad. And I said, when the meeting starts, Eddie, I want you to open the notepad and start making notes in it. And he said, but John, I can't write. I don't know how to write. And I said, doesn't matter. Just make some squiggles and close it up. And then I said, I guarantee they're going to ask you, what are you writing? And I said, tell them it's personal.
I love
So
it.
the same executive director said that he was going to look into giving Eddie a look at his folder, called me up and said, when did you teach Eddie to write? He's taking notes on our staff and he won't share them with them. And I said, well, isn't that interesting? And it just changed the whole dynamic. Then is it really Eddie's team if they have all these files about him that he has no idea what's in them? And why is it just the times he screwed up? So again, if we're calling staff up and say, Paul, I just talked to Eddie. He's so excited about what you've been doing with him, how he's learning to cook at home. And, that's great. How did you get that to happen? How did you get that to move in that right direction instead of calling up 2 weeks later and say, hey, Eddie had an incident at the Walmart. What in the hell's wrong with you, Paul? What happened? We've got to change the dynamic. None of us always like to be corrected on things. And so what we do with Quillo is usually short, positive messages. It's not social media. You control. It's all moderated. And the idea is you bring people along by looking at, the areas that, if they're in employment, they're going to get more videos about jobs and helping people find a right job and focusing on working with nice people and where they want to work. If it's about residential or learning to cook or learning to do things and it's bad weather. I know it's never bad weather in Toledo, right?
Never.
So there's times you had to stay inside. And what do you do that is inside that's fun? That's not just watching TV. And how do you have people do that? We have a whole series that a doctor helped us do out of Fort Worth, Texas, about people that are experiencing early onset of dementia. That is just fascinating that, if I walk into Tony, you and Paul and say, I just had lunch with the Pope today. Your job isn't to dissuade me that I had lunch with the Pope, because I believe that. Your job is to say, how was it? What'd you have to eat? And then move on. Because the idea that my mind is in a place that you're never going to convince me, you're just going to make me mad. So the idea, if you're dealing with someone with dementia, and sadly a number of our folks experience early onset of dementia, how do you help them be comfortable with where they're at instead of correcting them along the way? So we try to explore some things. We also explore some things that we, as I think in the provider community, have to be aware of, is that women with disability have a 70% to 80% chance of being abused during their lifetime. Women who make up the bulk of our workforce are far more likely to experience sexual abuse, either physical, verbal. And how do we respond to that? And how do we help people deal with that issue? And so we have a series of experts that have helped us talk about that if you experience something with a coworker that you're worried that she has been abused, how do you help them? Because they're largely not going to talk about it. And they're especially probably not going to talk about it if you're their supervisor and if you're a man. Mm-hmm. So then how do you help people, and how do you help people with disabilities understand the impact of this? Because the studies with people with disabilities, it's largely somebody you know that's going to abuse you. It's equally a staff member, a family member, or another person with a disability. Mm-hmm. So it's not that stranger down the street that's a violent offender or on the sexual abuse registry. It's going to be much more likely it's somebody you know and trust. So how do you help somebody prepare for that and deal with that? These are issues that go beyond our role as providers, but our role as people and human beings that we want to talk about. And again, sometimes people say, we don't have time to work on this. And I hear that all the time. And my answer is, you got to find 15 minutes a week. Can you give me 15 minutes a week to work on this? Can you find 15 minutes to talk to your staff? And sometimes they say, we don't know what to talk to them about. And the thing that I say back to them is, if you could talk to Paul the day before he was going to decide to quit, what would you say to him? If you were having coffee with Paul and you knew that he was going to quit tomorrow, what would you say to him today? Now, we don't know that about people, but that's what you have to communicate from the heart and talk to folks about this relationship that you want with them and have with them, and is based on positive interaction. One of our customers did something really cool. The CEO said, okay, I'm going to take your 15-minute challenge. And he had his HR people give him a list of 5 staff every day and their cell phone numbers. And he called them up and he said, Paul, this is John. John who? Well, John here at the agency. Why are you calling me? Am I in trouble? No, man, I'm just checking in with you. See what you're doing. How are we doing? What's happening? And what can we do better to help you through these tough times? And he would do 5 few minute calls with folks. Next day he had 5 more. And he picked 5 because that way in a year he could get to everybody in their agency and reach out to them. All of a sudden there was this buzz going on in the agency saying, the boss is calling us up, just asking us how we're doing. Wow. Now, he had to carve out, would start out at 15 minutes and then 30 minutes. He said, this is the best part of my day. Mm-hmm. I'm not in meetings. I'm talking to the people on the front lines. And he'd come back into his management team and said, you know what Paul told me over on the First Avenue waiver home? We have this really stupid process we're doing. Why are we doing it this way? It became this way of engaging people in a different way. The last thing I'll share about that is that as we think about engagement, I would ask people to think about the word validation. People stay when they feel their contribution is being acknowledged and validated, that they make a difference. Mm-hmm. Because if they're treated like a commodity that comes and goes, then they can work at McDonald's because they're no different than that. So validation is one of the messages we keep coming back to people about sharing it. One of our folks did a kind of a fun video where they just asked in 15 people. They said, we're going to create some training videos, and you're one of our best staff. We'd like you to come in and be part of these training videos. We're going to pay you for it. Come on in. And instead, they flipped the script, and they just had you sit down, Tony, and said, Tony, you've got this great, beautiful smile when you smile. Oh, it just lights up the whole room. It's just beautiful. And they're on camera. And, of course, cuts them totally by surprise. And somebody else they bring in, they say, you just got this attitude around you that just makes everybody want to be with you. That's beautiful. They found something to compliment every one of them and put all this together in a 1-minute video. After it was all done, this one woman came to him. She's 47 years old. And she said, you're the first person in my life that I worked for that ever said I was beautiful.
Wow.
What does that say to us then about how we change that dynamic with people and the value they have for being part of our organization, that sense of belonging? And it starts small. And what you're doing, Tony, is just so wonderful because you got to start small. You can't do giant things. There's this great book. It's called Atomic Habits. Mm-hmm. Yeah, have you read that?
Yes,
I love
sir.
that book.
Yeah. Great,
And book. It's not blowing up the world and doing everything different. It's starting really small and building.
Micro. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what you're doing, and it's what we're hoping to do with Quillo and Quillo Connect with families, because we also want to build up with families and people with disabilities their sense of high expectations, that there's value in their life, and they can set out goals that aren't based on what they can't do. You know, I went to college to play. I was a defensive lineman. I'm 6'5" and about 330 pounds. I thought the coaches in high school made a mistake. I thought I could be the first 350-pound NFL quarterback who couldn't run, couldn't throw the ball, but they wisely put me on the defensive line, and it paid me way through college. But that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy the game of football. I didn't enjoy being a team and being part of something, even though I didn't play the position I thought I was meant to play. It all comes down to that sense of validation and belonging. And it's just something that changes from the top, and it's just something you do in small bites.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of back to mention what you were talking about, it got me kind of in the zone of thinking of basically cultural diversity, because that's a lot of the problem we have. You spoke on the dynamic of how many DSPs are either African American versus those who are European Caucasian, and the dynamic typically changes from the person, the DSP in the home, having a complexion like mine. The higher you get, the lighter it gets.
Yes.
And that is, I think, where a lot of the change needs to come from, because even the management, they're not living in the same neighborhoods. I grew up in some of the toughest parts of Toledo during the crack epidemic. My mother, rest her soul, was a user, so I mean, she was only a teenager when I was born, so anywhere she was going, if she didn't want my granny to know what was going on, she would bring me with her, and I'd just sleep in the back seat. She'd never put me in the trunk, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep, I knew what you meant. Yeah,
yeah. Or my grandmother would watch me, but I saw a lot of things that, I think was a dealing with trauma that I have still to this day in certain regards to some stuff, but I noticed a lot of families that we service, they don't understand that struggle. The same way you can hear far right and far left argue about it, neither one of them knows the real struggle. And I've been blessed to have this opportunity to come from one area, to grow up in another, and be able to see the differences that have transcended due to either lack of funds, lack of education, just lack of empathy, given. And so I think a lot of sit downs need to happen with families. I'm like, look, this is something that you're not used to, but this isn't something that we should determine to break the relationship off with this person. Let's try to understand each other first and move forward. So do you feel as if cultural diversity would help solve a lot of these solutions too, if we just got out of our comfort zone?
Absolutely, and being aware. And it is so important. I mean, we hired a new director of digital community at Quillo. She's a young Latina, grew up in Miami. She's from Nicaragua originally. Her mother was. She was born in this country. And as we start thinking about a digital community, we realize we're incredibly diverse. And even within the Black community, we have a very large population of people in Indiana in the service providing world that are from West Africa. And so if they're from Liberia and Nigeria, and somebody looks like them and says, your cultural differences are very different than somebody who grew up in Toledo and experiences. And they're trying to fit in. And if you're a white family being served by this person, you may not understand their culture and how wonderful that is, and how to learn about that, and how to share and embrace that. We're actually launching. It's great to be with you on this podcast, because we're actually launching QuillowPod May 5th, and we chose our first podcast is all about diversity, and how do you be aware of that? For most organizations, when they want to address diversity, they look for one of their Black staff members or Hispanic staff member, put them in charge of diversity. I take it the other way. I said, white leadership, which the service industry is largely predominantly white, and the management, and you've got to be present within communities of color to really listen and understand before you ask somebody to come and represent all people of color. And if you haven't looked at the work of Eric Carter at Vanderbilt on the process of belonging, and he focuses primarily on faith homes, and realistically, because people with disabilities who have a faith home, a mosque, a synagogue, or a church, are 40% more likely to have non-paid friends in their life that spend quality time with them. So if our goal is friendships and relationships, and our people suffer from loneliness, here's a path. Not telling you which church to go to, or even if you got to go what, but you got to find friends, and you got to go to where potential friends are. But he talks about belonging. And the first thing he says is you've got to be present where people are. Don't expect people of color to come to you and tell them what the world's like. Go to them, hang out where they're at, make you feel uncomfortable. Both of my kids are African American, and so we joined an African American church. And being the only white faces on Sunday morning for that 3 hours was this amazing experience. And the pastor said, the only person that had a problem with this in this church is you. So if you don't have a problem, none of us have a problem. And he was right, but our kids grew up in a different experience of what it was like. And so you're absolutely right, Tony, that a really good dad said to me one time, he said, I don't understand this DSP that works with my son. We love him. He's great. But his car keeps breaking down. Why doesn't he just go buy a new car?
Nope.
In his life, you have a bad car. You went out, got a loan, you bought a car. And I said, something like, this is old data, but 60% of our workforce is what they call underbanked. They don't have a steady bank account. They don't write checks. They write off a debit card. They don't have a savings account. It's one of the things we wrote a little 3-page paper on of ideas people are trying to do to help people get through financial insecurity. And how do you help them? You can't make them all middle class, but how can you help them through rough parts of their life when things happen? And I said to him, they're making maybe $9, $10, $11 an hour. And he said, damn, can't buy a new car if you're only making $10 an hour. I said, you can't even buy a decent used car. And so what he did, he went to this person. He said, I'd like to help you get a decent car. He said, I've been lucky in life. Let's go car shopping and see what we can do. He said, no commitments. And he ended up buying the guy a $6,000 car. And just as a thank you. Now, that's rare, right? Most people can't do that. But he did that. And to this day, that staff member is still working with his son, And I'm not saying he bought him that way, but he's been promoted in the organization. And how do we do it? The other thing is we understand cultural differences. We understand what people will say and won't say. If you come from certain cultures, you don't speak up for yourself. And so how do we welcome that, and how do we do that? And I believe it comes by getting to know your staff, getting to know what they do. One of the things Cynthia talks about is she did some work on vaccination with the Hispanic community. They found their greatest vaccination rate when they went to soccer games on Saturdays and Sundays, because they were aiming at the Hispanic community, and they play soccer. Yeah. And the whole family comes while they go play soccer. And they went to where they're at instead of asking them to come to them. And I think it's all that example of how do we change our thinking and try some things that may or may not work. But we keep trying, because we learn as much when things fail, right? As we do when they work.
I think we learn more.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Often.
I think you're right.
So, John, this is one of Tony and my favorite parts of the show. We like to play a little game show with you to lighten the mood, because we've noticed over the years this topics get a little heavy, which, in the DD field, things can get a little heavy when we start talking on this podcast. So we want to lighten it up. So, Tony, why don't you hit it?
Rapid fire! If you are not familiar, rapid fire is a part of the show where I ask 3 questions. Those questions are shaped in a would you rather scenario. I can't promise you what I put down. Typically, it goes a little weird. So hopefully you're ready to have some fun.
Absolutely.
All right. First question. Would you rather never have to breathe but felt like you were suffocating, or never have to eat but always felt hungry? Ooh. Yeah, that's deep.
I'd rather never have to eat.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Like,
okay, I need to breathe.
Because if the way that I put the question, you can still eat even though you're not gonna feel hungry. All right, next one. Would you rather be on an empty beach when it's cloudy, or be on a crowded beach when it's sunny?
Crowded beach when it's sunny.
There you go. People person. Yep. That's, I'd rather have some conversations with people and stuff. All right. Last one. And I have a personal favorite for this one. Would you rather have a missing finger or 3 extra ones on one hand?
Ooh, 3 extra ones, I think.
Me too. That's the one I would choose. Why would you choose it?
Well, I was just thinking about all the times that, you're trying to hold on to things, and having 3 extra fingers would make it a little bit easier. I always keep dropping things. So if I had 3 extra fingers, maybe I'd drop less things along the way.
I hear you. I was thinking more like if I'm driving road rage style, I can do a double birdie with one hand. That would be pretty cool.
You could type a lot faster too.
Yeah, that's right.
3 extra.
Well, you'd have to learn a whole new way.
What did Jim Carrey have on the one movie where he was answering all the emails?
Oh yeah,
Bruce Almighty.
Bruce Almighty. Yeah. So, John, this has been an amazing conversation.
Yes.
I learned a lot. I'm sure Tony learned a lot as well.
Very much.
You have so much good, and we're so happy to continually meet people like you, just to open our minds, because we're trying to make this field better for everyone and share this information with them, because in the end, the goal is to help people. We want to help people. We want to get the public persona of people with disabilities changed to just treat them as people and not some outcast part of society, and you've been in this field for a very long time. So we appreciate the work that you've done and you continue to do. You're never going to quit. You're just going to keep going forever, I think, and making changes in this field. So if you could, go ahead.
No, I thank you guys, because you're thinking outside the box, and thank you for what you're doing, because every day you get up, there's a new challenge that you weren't expecting from the day before. And it is again as hard as it's ever been, but this is when we're needed. One of the early founders of the ARC, I was back in the 90s during one of the last economic crises we had. I left the legislature, was feeling a little sorry for myself. And I went down to speak at their annual dinner, and this lady's about 5 foot tall, probably weighed 90 pounds. And I must have started whining to her a little bit about how hard it was. And she hauled up and hit me. And she said, what the hell's wrong with you? It's never been easy. It's never going to be easy. That's why we need you. And that's why we need you guys right now. We need leaders that are thinking differently, spreading the word. And thank you for doing this podcast. And thanks for having me on it.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And before we wrap up, if you want to let our listeners know where they can learn more about Quillo or you personally, or any information that you'd like to share with them.
And the Q-Pod coming out.
The podcast.
So yes, our website is myquillo.com. And you can get to either Quillo Pro, which is our one for staff, or Quillo Connect for families there. And that's where we'll be launching our podcast. One of my, key goals is, again, to try to make the world better for folks. And exactly where you guys are at. It isn't about just having a business that succeeds. We hope it does. But it's all about how do we make it better for folks along the way. So thanks for having me on. And again, myquillo.com. And appreciate what you guys are doing every day, and hope we'll stay in touch.